I followed my cheating wife, convinced it was just a passing suspicion. She had always been meticulous, predictable. Every day at 8 a.m., leave for work without any changes to your routine. But that day, something was wrong, a pang of uncertainty gnawed at me. I had noticed subtle changes, the stronger perfume, the more sophisticated makeup, more frequent text messages and hushed laughter in the corner of the room. But it wasn't just paranoia. Not this time. I decided to follow in his footsteps. Without her noticing, I discreetly followed her. She didn't know I was watching her. I saw his car turn a corner, not heading to work as usual, but heading another way. My heart accelerated. Adrenaline drove me, but with every second that passed, a dull pain took over me, a mixture of anguish and anger. Am I crazy? I thought. But the answer was there, on the unexpected route, on the uncertain destination. And then, she stopped. A remote cafe, one of those places where people hide and are not seen. I parked some distance away and saw her get out of the car, anxious. With every step she took, my breathing became shorter. And then, he appeared. A man. They hugged each other like old acquaintances, intimate, as if I had never existed. I saw the kiss they exchanged, long, full of a passion that I hadn't seen in our house for a long time. A tightness took over my chest. My head was spinning, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. That man I had never seen before was now stealing something that, until then, I believed was mine. The shock paralyzed me. There, at that moment, everything I knew about us fell apart. I wanted to get out of the car, confront them, scream, do something. But I couldn't. I stood there, watching my life be torn apart before me. I was overcome by a feeling of helplessness, of betrayal, a pain so deep it seemed physical. What did I do wrong? The question echoed in my head, over and over again. I knew I couldn't go back. Nothing would be like before. The decision was immediate, I wanted a divorce. There was no more room for doubts, for concessions. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. But when I made that decision, little did I know that the real hell was yet to come. The lover was not just any man. He knew who I was. I knew what I was doing. And when he realized I was about to expose everything, he found me first. An anonymous message appeared on my cell phone days after the meeting. If you think you can get this over with without consequences, think again. I know things about you. Things that can destroy your life. Panic took over. I took it as an empty threat, a desperate attempt to intimidate me. But then, a series of unexpected events began to surround me. My finances were compromised, secrets I kept hidden from everyone began to come to light. It was as if he knew my every step, every mistake I had ever made. Not only did he steal my wife, but he also began stealing my life, piece by piece, until I began to wonder, what was really at stake here? Was it just a betrayal? Or something much bigger? Welcome to the channel. Here, we in no way support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful truth: betrayal destroys lives, families and hearts. Our goal is to show the devastating consequences that these choices can bring. Now, get ready for an intense story, full of twists and turns and strong emotions. I wish you a good story, and I guarantee it will be shocking. Los Angeles was especially beautiful that morning. The sun illuminated the streets in an almost cinematic way, creating golden reflections on the skyscrapers, while the city was buzzing with life. The gentle breeze coming from the ocean brought with it fresh air, in contrast to the routine that had already become exhausting for many people. Among these people was Daniel. Daniel, a man in his 40s, had a life that many would consider ideal. He was successful in his career as an architect, working on high-profile projects. He had built, with effort and dedication, a stable life, and this brought him a feeling of security. His marriage to Laura was considered by everyone as an example. They were the couple everyone admired. Together for more than 15 years, they had a connection that seemed unbreakable. At least, that was how everyone saw it from the outside. Laura was a vibrant woman, in her 30s, elegant, with an energy that infected those around her. Working as a marketing manager for a large company, she maintained a hectic routine, full of meetings and appointments, but always managed to balance her personal and professional life impeccably. When she was at home, she seemed to be the center of the house's energy, always attentive to Daniel's needs and taking care of every detail so that everything was in perfect harmony. She radiated a confidence that, at first, enchanted Daniel. In the early years, life together was full of sweet moments. They used to travel together, explore new places and always found time for each other. When the children did not come, despite some failed fertilization attempts, the two decided to focus on their careers and live the present in the best way possible. Daniel had never cared about that. In fact, he admired Laura's strength and resilience in accepting this part of life. The house they shared was a reflection of what they had both built, modern, welcoming, full of shared memories and little symbols of love scattered throughout the rooms. However, there was something new, almost imperceptible, in the air. Daniel had been feeling a sense of distance. Small details began to accumulate, shorter conversations, glances that didn't meet as before, a slight sensation that something between them was changing. Sometimes he thought maybe it was the routine, the weight of the years. But no matter how much he tried to shake off this feeling, doubt lodged itself deeper and deeper in his mind. He watched her get ready in the morning, always impeccable, while they exchanged just a few quick words. That comfortable familiarity they shared before had turned into a calculated, almost mechanical routine. Laura, in turn, was more distant, but in a way that seemed discreet, as if she was trying not to attract attention. He spent more time at work, justifying it with the need to participate in new projects and the increased responsibility of his position. She was always busy, or so she said. The phone was always in his hands, quick messages and short laughs as he typed. Daniel didn't care about her work, but something about the smiles she hid behind her cell phone made his stomach turn. Even though he tried to ignore it, he couldn't help but notice how she was increasingly involved with something or someone that wasn't part of their life together. At night, things were no longer the same. Intimacy had cooled and conversations, which previously flowed naturally, now seemed forced. Daniel often watched her at the dinner table, his eyes downcast, distracted, and he couldn't help but feel that Laura was far, far away from him, even when she was physically present. Even so, he continued to hold on to the silence, believing it was just a phase, something that would eventually pass. The weekends, which used to be their time, were now always occupied with social events or her work commitments. Even the little getaways they used to take together, a trip to the movies, dinner at a new restaurant, were becoming rare. Daniel didn't know how to start a conversation about what he felt, worried that maybe it was all in his head. But the doubt continued to grow, like a shadow that hovered over his mind. Sometimes Daniel thought about talking about his worries, but the words died in his throat. Maybe he was just paranoid, maybe life was taking its toll, and this was just a common phase in every long relationship. But what he couldn't ignore were the moments when he caught Laura looking at him in a way he couldn't decipher. It wasn't exactly lovelessness, but it was far from the passion that consumed them before. To try to reverse what seemed like an inevitable disconnect, Daniel suggested a trip. A weekend away, maybe something that could rekindle the flame between them. Laura, always practical, agreed quickly, but with a coldness that bothered him. Still, he decided he would do his best to make that weekend an opportunity to reconnect. They went to a secluded cabin, a place that used to be special to both of them. However, upon arrival, the distance between them became even more palpable. Laura was physically present, but her mind seemed to wander elsewhere. During a candlelit dinner, while Daniel tried to bring up happy memories of the past, she responded in monosyllables, lost in thoughts he couldn't reach. That night, as the rain fell outside, Daniel woke up in the middle of the night. Laura wasn't next to him in bed. The emptiness beside him seemed to echo what he already knew, but didn't want to admit. When he found her sitting on the porch, staring into space, the question he feared formed in his mind. But, as always, he remained silent. He went back to bed and pretended to sleep, feeling the weight of uncertainty crush his chest. That night in the cabin was the culmination of a long journey of silences and unspoken feelings. When they returned to the city, everything seemed to be back to normal, but Daniel knew that what they had built was in ruins, even if he still couldn't clearly see the cracks. The silence between them now seemed like an impossible chasm to cross. What Daniel didn't yet know was that the hole that was forming in his relationship was about to open up in a devastating way. Laura had already crossed a line from which she could never return. And he, trapped in his attempts to deny the obvious, was on the verge of discovering a truth that would change him forever. The path was being drawn, and both, without even realizing it, were about to face the consequences of their actions, or lack thereof. The days following the trip were strangely silent. Daniel realized that despite his efforts to salvage what was left of his marriage, something had irrevocably changed. Laura was increasingly distant. Their work hours were extended without explanation, and the moments they spent together, once so natural, now seemed forced, as if they were just two people sharing the same space, but in completely different universes. Evenings, previously shared with conversations, laughter and small gestures of affection, were replaced by long periods of silence. Laura retired early or said she was exhausted, while Daniel sank into the sofa, the TV on, but his thoughts far away. He found himself analyzing every detail, looking for signs. His mind was running in circles, trying to find an answer to what was happening. But no matter how hard he looked, he only found emptiness. One late afternoon, upon arriving home from work, Daniel found the house empty. Laura had mentioned something about a business dinner, something common in her work routine. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table, deep in thought. Her phone, left carelessly on the table, vibrated with a message. Daniel instinctively looked at the screen. It was a simple, direct message, but the content made his heart race. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. I can't wait any longer. The message didn't come from any number he recognized, and the familiarity in the words left him paralyzed. His first impulse was to ignore, to erase from his mind what he had just seen. But something inside him, a voice long ignored, forced him to pick up the phone. He unlocked the device with shaking hands, and what he saw over the next few days was devastating. Frequent exchanges of messages, full of intimacy and affection, between Laura and someone whose name he did not know. The content of the messages was too clear for there to be any doubt, she was with someone else. Daniel felt the ground slip away from beneath his feet. The wine in his hand shook, and for a moment he wondered if this was real. The words floated across his cell phone screen like a punch straight to the gut, each sentence filled with a betrayal he never imagined possible. What hurt him most was not just the explicit content, but the way Laura seemed involved, emotionally and physically, in something he had no idea existed. She had hidden it so well, so carefully, that he felt like a complete fool. At first, he tried to rationalize. He thought maybe it was just a phase, a temporary distraction, something that didn't mean much. But as he read the messages, saw the detailed plans, the hidden meetings, the moments she shared with that other man, Daniel realized that this was not something temporary. It was a reality he had ignored for too long. She was committed to another, in a way he thought was unique to them. Daniel's breathing quickened as anger began to boil within him. Questions tormented him. How was she able to? How long had this been going on? And why? What had he done wrong? His thoughts mixed with the growing sound of his own frustration. He closed his eyes, trying to control the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. But there was no turning back. The damage was done. Over the next few days, Daniel watched her closely. Their habits, their schedules, their excuses, everything seemed to fit into a pattern he hadn't seen before. The time she spent on her cell phone, the last-minute appointments, the business dinners that went on longer than necessary. Everything now made sense, but at the same time, he refused to believe this was happening. The love he felt for Laura was still there, mixed with pain and anger, creating a whirlwind of emotions that he didn't know how to deal with. He knew he couldn't confront her right away. I needed more proof, more clarity about the situation. He decided to follow in his footsteps, observe every movement. That Friday, when she said she would stay late at a work meeting, Daniel followed Laura to a discreet hotel in the city center. He saw her car park and, shortly after, he saw the man from the messages appear. They didn't hide. When he saw them together, laughing, exchanging caresses at the hotel entrance, the truth was drawn before his eyes in an indisputable way. The pain of betrayal hit Daniel with full force at that moment. Every laugh, every touch between the two felt like a knife going through his chest. He felt as if the world around him was falling apart, as if the ground beneath his feet was about to collapse. They disappeared through the hotel door, and Daniel stood there, outside, with his heart in pieces, unable to process what he had just seen. The night seemed to drag on as Daniel drove home, in silence, trying to understand how his life had gotten to this point. The man Laura cheated on him with was now a real presence, someone who was inside his life without him realizing it. The image of the two of them together never left his mind. He needed to confront her, but at the same time, he knew that this confrontation would only be the beginning of something much bigger and darker. The path was set. The confrontation was inevitable, but Daniel still didn't know that, beyond the betrayal, there was something even darker waiting to be discovered. Daniel entered the house that night with a feeling of emptiness, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. He felt like an intruder in his own life, living a reality that was not his. Laura's betrayal burned in his mind, but what came after was what haunted him. He knew he would confront her, he knew things wouldn't be easy, but he never imagined how deep that abyss could be. The next day, the clock showed 8 in the evening. Laura had left for another of her business meetings. But Daniel, after following his wife's every step, already knew exactly where she was. There was no longer any need to spy. The emptiness he felt no longer came from doubt, but from the brutal certainty that had settled deep in his heart. He was betrayed, and now he knew who the other man was. The messages on Laura's cell phone had revealed that. He was someone influential, someone with power, someone who didn't hesitate to use it to his advantage. For hours, Daniel sat in the dark living room, the silence of the house only broken by the ticking of the clock. The decision was made. The confrontation would be today. He had to let it all out, not just because of the betrayal, but because of the pieces that were starting to fall into place in his mind. Something had been wrong for much longer than he had realized. When Laura entered the house, the atmosphere was dense, suffocating. She carried the same expression as always, a vague, indifferent smile. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for her. The dim lights reflected on his tired face. Seeing him there, Laura's smile fell. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm but low. Laura stopped, surprised. She wasn't used to that tone of voice. Something inside her stirred, a twinge of warning, but she covered it with her usual serenity. "Of course," he replied, approaching the table and pulling out a chair to sit in front of him. She tried to adopt a relaxed posture, but there was a tension in the air that she couldn't ignore. Daniel stared at her for a moment, saying nothing. He observed every detail, the way she avoided his eyes, the movement of her restless hands. Betrayal was written in every gesture, but what he needed to say went far beyond infidelity. "I know about you and him," he blurted out, with a tone that made the air feel heavier. The silence that followed was deafening. Laura froze. His eyes, which were previously trying to maintain composure, wavered. But she didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and chose his words carefully, as if one bad choice could cause an irreversible explosion. "Daniel, I don't know what you're talking about." The lie came quickly, almost instinctively. But the conviction in her voice was no longer as strong. He laughed, a bitter laugh that echoed through the kitchen. Don't you know? He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and placed it on the table. I saw the messages, Laura. I followed you. Her face paled. The words she had prepared disappeared from her mind. What could she say now? She had been careful, yes, but she never imagined he would get this far. Fear began to take over, mixed with silent anger at being caught. Daniel, listen to me. She began, but he interrupted her. Listen to what? You're going to tell me it was a mistake? That it doesn't mean anything? I saw you together, Laura. I saw you with him. His voice shook with suppressed anger. The pain of betrayal was still raw, but what gnawed at him inside was the feeling of having been thrown aside as if he were nothing. Laura lowered her head. She knew there was no denying it. The confrontation she so feared had arrived, and she was completely unprepared to deal with it. But there was something more, something that hadn't yet been said. And that something was what terrified her the most. You're right. I betrayed you, he confessed, his voice low, almost inaudible. But, things aren't that simple. Daniel remained silent, waiting for her to continue, but the words felt heavy in Laura's throat. She looked at her hands, unable to meet her husband's eyes. What do you mean, they're not that simple? Daniel asked, frustration growing. You're with another man. Tell me, what could be more complicated than that? She bit her lip, hesitating. She knew that this was the time to let it all out, but the fear of what would happen next paralyzed her. She tried to think of a way out, a way to lessen the impact, but there was no way to escape. He's not just a lover, Daniel, he said, his voice weak. He's more than that. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the way she said it made his heart clench in a way he had never felt before. What are you trying to say? She lifted her head slowly, her eyes finally meeting his. He knows things about you. He has information that could destroy you. Daniel frowned, confused. What are you talking about? What information? He's powerful, Daniel. He has contacts, resources. He knows about the business, about what you do. And if you try to leave me, he'll expose everything. He'll ruin you. The words came out all at once, and Laura looked exhausted, as if she were finally freeing herself from a weight that had been crushing her for months. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. How would he know anything about me, he asked, but he was already starting to connect the dots. In recent months, his business had undergone inexplicable upheavals. Small contracts lost, deals that were once guaranteed starting to fail for no apparent reason. He had chalked it up to bad luck, but now, everything was starting to make sense. Laura didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, her eyes full of fear and regret. She knew what was coming, and she knew this was just the beginning. He was manipulating me, Daniel. He used our relationship to get what he wanted. I never wanted things to come to this. But now we're trapped. And if you make any moves against him, he'll be done with everything. Daniel stood up from his chair, pacing around the kitchen like a caged animal. Laura's words echoed in his head, but he refused to believe them. How could she allow that to happen? How did she let her life become entwined with a man capable of destroying everything they had built? So that's it, he asked, his voice hoarse. You betrayed me, and now he's using it against us. Laura nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. She tried to speak, but the pain and fear suffocated her. I didn't know he would go this far. I thought it was just a passing thing. But now he has control over everything, Daniel. I'm so sorry. Daniel stopped, hands clenching in his hair in frustration. Laura's betrayal was devastating, but what hurt him most was the realization that he was now being blackmailed, used as a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. The silence that settled in the kitchen seemed too heavy to be broken. Daniel felt the weight of the revelation still pressing on his chest, a mixture of betrayal, humiliation and, now, the fear of something much bigger than what he had imagined. Laura remained sitting, looking lost, as if she were trapped in the consequences of her own choices. He didn't know how to deal with the whirlwind of emotions that had invaded his mind. What was once just marital betrayal had turned into a much darker and increasingly suffocating web. The following days were a dense fog for Daniel. He was torn between the desire to explode, to confront that man and put an end to everything, and the prudence that the threat brought. Every time he thought about taking action, Laura's voice, repeating that he could be destroyed, echoed in his mind. And with that came fear. Fear of the unknown, of the power that man seemed to have over him, fear of how much the situation had gotten out of control without him knowing. The dilemma was suffocating: remain silent and swallow the humiliation of his own betrayal, or take a risk and fight against someone who apparently knew more about him than he should. The nights became long and sleepless. Laura no longer tried to justify herself, she just waited for his next move. They slept in separate rooms now, like two strangers living under the same roof. The love, the trust, everything they had built over the years seemed to have disappeared, evaporated along with the brutal revelation of that betrayal. But Daniel couldn't help but wonder, how planned was it all? Had Laura fallen into the clutches of someone manipulative and unscrupulous, or was there more? She had betrayed him, yes, but was she just a victim in all of this? These questions tormented him. He could no longer look at her without feeling a mixture of anger and compassion. There was a constant internal struggle, and he no longer knew which side was winning. One morning, while trying to work, a phone call changed the dynamics of his thinking. An unknown number appeared on his cell phone screen. His initial instinct was to ignore it, but something inside him made him respond. The voice on the other end of the line was cold, calculated. "You know who I am," said the man, bluntly. "And he knows what's at stake." Daniel froze. The man did not need to introduce himself, the threat was clear. "I know what you did. I know where your weaknesses lie. I know you are trying to resist, but I suggest you think carefully." He took a deep breath, trying to control the anger that was about to boil over. "What do you want from me?" he asked, keeping his voice steady, but feeling tension taking over his body. "What do I want?" The man let out a dry laugh. "I already have what I want. Your wife, your secrets. What I need now is your cooperation to make sure everything stays in the right place. You will continue to live your life normally, as if nothing is happening. But remember, if, Daniel, any wrong move, any attempt at retaliation, and it all comes to a head. And you know what I'm talking about." The silence between them was like a sharp blade. Daniel, with the phone still pressed to his ear, felt sweat running down his forehead. "And what exactly do you expect me to do? Pretend nothing is happening?" "Exactly. Continue with your routine, be the exemplary husband you always were. But don't forget that I'm watching. Always. One false step and you lose everything." The call ended abruptly, leaving Daniel in a state of shock. He gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles white as he processed what he had just heard. The already unbearable situation had just become even worse. Now, it wasn't just about his personal life, but something much bigger. There was a constant, invisible threat that hung over his head. He was trapped in a trap that he himself didn't know how to escape. The days dragged on, and Daniel didn't know how to react. He watched Laura around the house, trying to find in her eyes some trace of the woman he had loved, but all he saw was fear. She knew she was in that man's hands, and, in a way, she was also trapped, just as much as he was. The few conversations they had were short, distant, and avoided the real issue. It was as if they were both aware of the gulf between them but unable to confront it directly. One night, after another of these silent conversations, Daniel sat alone in the living room. He felt the weight of the situation tighten on his chest, slowly suffocating him. Everything he had built, his work, his reputation, his marriage, was threatened. And, as much as he wanted to react, he felt powerless in the face of something so much bigger than himself. He began to wonder, how had he gotten to this point? How could someone who had always prided himself on being so careful, so meticulous, allow his life to fall apart like this? Laura's betrayal had hurt him deeply, but the feeling of being controlled by a stranger was even more devastating. Control of his own life had slipped out of his hands, and he no longer knew who he was in this scenario. The moral dilemma he faced was overwhelming. If he decided to confront the man and expose the truth, he would risk losing everything, his career, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom. But if he continued to live that lie, bearing the weight of betrayal and blackmail, he would lose himself completely. The man he had been until that moment would cease to exist. He knew he would need to make a decision soon. The pressure increased every day, and he couldn't sustain that theater much longer. However, every choice seemed to lead to inevitable destruction, one way or another. That night, Daniel made a decision. After days of living under the weight of blackmail and betrayal, he realized he could no longer be a puppet. The fear, the humiliation and the feeling of helplessness were slowly destroying him, eating away at him from the inside out. And although the consequences were unpredictable, he knew he needed to regain control of his life, no matter what the cost. At dawn, he sat at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had started to fall apart, waiting for Laura to wake up. When she finally appeared, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights, there was a dense silence between them. But this time, Daniel didn't hesitate. "This ends today," he said, his voice firm. "I will no longer live with this fear, with this shadow over us." Laura stopped, surprised by the conviction in his words. She knew what he was saying, but what scared her most was what might happen next. She tried to get closer, tried to find some trace of compassion in his eyes, but it was clear, that man who had endured everything, trying to save what was left of his marriage, was no more. "Daniel, please, we can't face this. You don't understand what he can do." Her voice was a mix of despair and regret, as if the consequences of her actions were finally falling upon her. But Daniel was no longer willing to listen to justifications. "I understand perfectly, Laura. I understand that you have put us in the hands of a man who cares about nothing but power. But I will no longer accept this. If he wants to destroy me, let him try." Laura collapsed into the chair, her face covered in her hands. She knew she had gone too far, that there was no turning back. The man she had become involved with was not just a passing lover. He was someone willing to destroy everything to get what he wanted, and now, she and Daniel were trapped in that dangerous web. Daniel didn't waste any more time. He picked up his phone and made the call he had been putting off. His lawyer, a confidant for many years, responded immediately. "I need you to investigate something," he said. "There is a man. He is blackmailing me. I can't give you all the details right now, but I need your help tracking this down." In the following days, the research began to take shape. Daniel's lawyer was skilled, and the connections this mysterious man had established began to reveal themselves. Little clues here and there, questionable contracts, money movements that didn't make sense. The puzzle slowly began to come together. And then, one night, the truth came out. The man Laura called her lover wasn't just any businessman. He was involved in a money laundering scheme, using his relationship with Laura to infiltrate Daniel's business. The idea was simple: manipulate Laura so that she would facilitate access to sensitive information, destroy Daniel's reputation and thus take control of the most lucrative contracts that Daniel's company managed. But what the man didn't expect was that Daniel, in his silent fury, would be more resilient than he imagined. With the evidence in hand, Daniel went to the police. The investigation, now out of his control, ran its course. The man was arrested, accused of fraud, extortion and a series of other crimes. The siege closed quickly, and all the pieces began to fall. Laura, however, was devastated. Although she knew the man's intentions, she never imagined that he would be capable of manipulating their lives in such a calculated way. And now, his betrayal had not only destroyed her marriage, but also put her in a position where her own freedom was at stake. Divorce was inevitable. Daniel, too hurt to forgive, went ahead with the process. The pain of losing the woman he loved and being betrayed by her would stay with him for a long time, but he knew that continuing that lie would be the same as destroying himself. Laura, in turn, was left alone, trapped by the consequences of her choices. Each day, she faced the void left by her own ruin. Daniel, as painful as it was, felt a sense of relief at the end. The life he knew had been destroyed, but now he was free from the chains that kept him trapped in that web of lies. He left the home he shared with Laura and began a new life, carrying the scars of that dark chapter, but with the certainty that he had regained control of his destiny. And so, the story ended. Not with a happy or redemptive ending, but with a real outcome, marked by the inevitable consequences of the choices made by each of the characters. Betrayal, manipulation, and pain were the cornerstones of this storyline, but in the end, Daniel emerged stronger, yet deeply scarred. Now that you've heard this story, I want to know, what did you think? Leave your comment and share your opinion about the dilemmas and choices of these characters. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support any type of cheating. The stories we tell are fictional, but they show how betrayal can destroy lives and relationships. Until the next story.